Both Grant and I are deaf mutes. He became deaf and mute due to a car accident the day after tomorrow, and was so devastated that he once wanted to commit suicide. We met on the rooftop of the hospital, fell in love there, and spent 5 years full of malice together. He told me in sign language, Grant will never let Valeria down. Later, he was in another car accident. Miraculously, his deaf-mute defect was cured, and he also became a hot new upstart in the Beijing social circle. However, he still told me that he would never let me down. But at his birthday party, thinking that I couldn't hear, he poured out his true feelings to his friends in front of me. She witnessed my most embarrassing past, and she's still a deaf-mute. It's quite embarrassing to take her out. I'd rather she disappeared so that I would remember her for the rest of my life. But he didn't know that in order to help him regain his confidence, I had pretended to be a deaf-mute for 5 years. On the day of the birthday party, Grant took me to meet his former good friends. Knowing that I couldn't hear, he taught his friends sign language on the spot just to say, "Hello, sister-in-law," to me. I blushed, sitting meekly beside him with a glass of juice in my hand, while secretly planning to find a suitable opportunity later to tell him my secret. It could also be regarded as a 30th birthday gift for him. Grant was having a great time, drinking one glass of wine after another, and the smile on his face couldn't be stopped. He kept chatting with his friends and was then dragged to sing. All in all, the party was lively. I was truly happy for him. A favored son of heaven shouldn't have any flaws. Now that he has recovered and become a hot new upstart in the Beijing social circle, those scornful and mocking gazes that once looked down on him have all turned into admiration and envy. My Grant has finally welcomed his new life. I watched him quietly, estimating the time of the party. When he got tired from playing and sat down beside me, I tugged at his clothes. He looked back at me with a doting smile and then began to sign to me. "Valeria, are you tired?" I shook my head and signed back to him, "I have something important to tell you." Grant nodded and was just about to take my hand and leave the private room when one of his buddies pressed his shoulder. "Don't run away. Have another 2 drinks?" That buddy showed no sign of letting go while speaking. Grant pointed at me and, afraid that I couldn't hear, explained while speaking and signing, "Valeria has something to tell me. I'll take her out for a while." I looked at him and then at the others in the private room. Everyone was still in high spirits. After thinking for a while, I shook my head at Grant. "It can wait. It's not easy for you all to get together today. You'd better enjoy yourselves to the fullest." Grant looked at my gestures, and a smile gradually appeared on his lips. He then reached out and ruffled my hair, muttering, "My Valeria is the sweetest." He didn't sign this. But I could still make out such a simple sentence by reading his lips. His unreserved praise and unabashed display of love always made me blush and lower my head, not daring to look at him. At such times, Grant's smile would grow even wider. "Valeria looks so cute when she's shy." He always liked to tease me. He knew full well that my face would turn bright red as soon as I heard sweet nothings, but he still couldn't help it, saying that I was the cutest like this. His buddy beside him also seemed quite interested in me. "Buddy, it seems you're really into pure love? But are you really going to marry her?" After hearing this, Grant leaned back slightly. I could only see his side profile and couldn't quite make out his lip movements. For deaf-mutes, if there are no gestures, they can only barely make out what the other person is saying by reading their lips. And if they can't even see the lip movements clearly, then for deaf-mutes, the whole world would be left in silence. Grant's actions clearly showed that he didn't want me to make out the conversation by reading his lips. I wondered what he was going to say. Could it be those sweet nothings that would make me blush again? I was guessing randomly in my mind. After thinking for a while, Grant began to answer the other person's question seriously. "Valeria is great. I've broken down countless times in the past 5 years, and she was always there with me. I'm very grateful to her and I love her very much. But she was born deaf and mute and it can't be cured. She also witnessed my most embarrassing past. Whenever I see Valeria, I have to use sign language to communicate with her, which always reminds me of the past. Honestly, it's quite uncomfortable. That's not the most important thing. The important thing is that now I've recovered, and the Grant family has also started to gain a firm foothold in the Beijing social circle. If people knew that I married a deaf-mute, who knows how those old foxes in the business world would laugh at me. If possible, I actually hoped that she would disappear after I recovered, so that I might remember her for the rest of my life, the kind that I can't forget. His buddy didn't seem to expect Grant would say such things, and the shock on his face was obvious. So, you don't want to marry her? Grant shook his head. I will marry her. After all, she's been with me for a full 5 years. After saying that, he held my hand tightly, his eyes still full of love, making it impossible to tell whether this love was real or fake. My face was calm, but my heart was beating fast, and there was also an indescribable pain. Because, I heard every word he said just now. I have a secret that I've been hiding from Grant for 5 whole years. I'm not a congenital deaf-mute at all. The first time I met Grant was when my parents had an accident while climbing a mountain. I waited outside the operating room for a day and a night, and then stayed outside the intensive care unit for more than half a month. Unfortunately, I never got to see them wake up. In just one night, I lost the 2 relatives who were related to me by blood in this world. The blow was so great that I fainted several times from crying. After fainting again, when I woke up, I found that I couldn't speak, just like a deaf-mute. The doctor told me that it was because my emotions had fluctuated too much and my body's self-protection mechanism had been activated, resulting in temporary loss of voice. Probably, I would recover in 2 or 3 months. Under the double blow, I was depressed all day long, and my heart was always heavy. To relieve myself, I thought of going to the rooftop of the hospital to get some fresh air. There, I met Grant, who was about to jump off the building. I rushed over and dragged him down. We both fell to the ground. As a result, my arm rubbed against the concrete floor, leaving a large area of bloody mess, and I gasped in pain. But I couldn't open my mouth or speak, so I could only point at him and then at myself. In his somewhat bewildered gaze, I stood up angrily and drew a big cross outside the rooftop. He should have understood what I meant. Suicide is not an option. But the smile on his face was bitter, and there was no color in his eyes. But it takes a lot of courage to jump again. At least Grant, who was sitting slumped on the ground, didn't have the courage to jump a second time. He picked up a small stone and began to write on the ground. You shouldn't have saved me. I had finally mustered up the courage to jump off the building, and now it's all ruined. Looking at the words he wrote, I raised my hand and patted him on the head, and then snatched the small stone from his hand. There are many hardships in the world. You can't just think of escaping. Unless you really have no attachment to this world, then you can jump off the building again without any burden. I could tell that he couldn't do it. Grant's current state was like being trapped in a self-made desperate situation, thinking again and again about whether to use death to free himself, but also longing in his heart for someone to pull him out of the abyss. I was very willing to be such a person. Because saving a life is better than building a 7-story pagoda. I wanted to accumulate some merits for my parents. Thus, we got to know each other. I learned that Grant used to be like a favored son of heaven, but unfortunately, he was in a car accident. Now he couldn't speak or hear, becoming a real deaf-mute, and according to the doctor's judgment, the possibility of recovery was very small. A favored son of heaven seemed unable to bear such a blow. And because I had temporary loss of voice, Grant regarded me as a kindred spirit, so he would resist others but not me. He would only feel that we were in the same boat. To make him live well, I told him, I'm congenitally deaf and mute. I've never heard a sound or spoken a word. You're not as miserable as I am, so you should live well and wait for the miracle day. A white light can bloom like a flower in the desert. Grant at that time needed someone to share his pain with him so much, to let him know that in this world, there was still someone who could walk with him. And I happened to appear in front of him. We met on the rooftop of the hospital. I saved him, and we became friends. We got along day by day, and from being the purest of friends, other feelings gradually grew. Also on this rooftop, he confessed his love to me. He told me in sign language, I thought the world was terrible, but I didn't expect to meet you. Valeria, if I were always like this, and if I could still have you by my side, I wouldn't feel sad about life, because thankfully there's you." He also said, "Grant will never let Valeria down." The sunset that day was really beautiful. The afterglow of the sunset shone on him. He stood in the light, stretched out his hand to me, and promised me a lifetime. I was moved and fell in love with the boy in front of me. From then on, it was out of control. But after we got together, we still received a lot of scorn from others. The life of a deaf-mute couple wasn't very smooth. Especially those who used to dislike him naturally tried every means to laugh at and tease him. But during these 5 years full of malice, we never let go of each other's hands. I thought he would surely be my final destination. We could share hardships. Even if it was a lifetime of hardships, we would never let go of each other. Until he was in another car accident. He was no longer deaf and mute, and his speaking voice was very pleasant. I would unconsciously be captivated by his voice and feel my heart flutter again and again. But just when I was about to tell Grant this secret, unexpectedly, my 5 years of companionship had actually become the heaviest burden in his heart. It was hard to say whether it was disappointment or sadness. Perhaps it was sorrow. I suddenly remembered that saying, many times, many people can share hardships but not prosperity. Such are the weaknesses of human nature. Just like Grant and I, at this moment, it was completely visualized. I suddenly felt very uncomfortable. When he reached out to hug me, I couldn't help but push him away hard and ran out of the private room without looking back. If his love isn't pure, then I'd rather not have it. I left without a word, making him lose face in front of his friends. Grant was very angry. He sent me a message, "All the people who came to this party are my friends. You ran away without a word like this. I can't even explain it. Forget it. You calm down. I won't go back these few days." Looking at the content of the message, I somehow felt it was a bit ironic. In the past, if Grant saw me leave suddenly like this, he would surely have shown great concern. He would be afraid that I had encountered some emergency situation or something had happened to me, and he would definitely choose to stay by my side until I smiled again. But now, his first reaction was just that I had embarrassed him. I couldn't quite describe how I felt inside. Probably, it was just a sense of stuffiness. It was like a huge stone pressing on my chest, making it a bit difficult for me to breathe, and I almost wanted to die. I was so sad. But the mobile phone in my hand kept ringing at this moment. Both Grant and I had the habit of using Weibo. We liked to share our daily lives on it. Even if there were few viewers, it was also a kind of silent catharsis. Just like at this moment, Grant had just updated his Weibo. I couldn't control myself and clicked on those photos as if I were torturing myself. In the photos, he and a group of friends went to the seaside. Everyone had a carefree smile on their face. Grant had his arm hooked around the neck of a strange girl beside him, holding a wine bottle in his other hand, with his eyes full of joy, carefree and without any worry about me at all. He was very happy. At this moment, our emotions reached two extremes. Grant was so eager to let off steam. During these 5 years, he had suffered countless scornful looks and ridicule. Now that he had recovered, he couldn't wait to announce it to the whole world and let everyone know that he was back to normal. For more than half a month in a row, Grant had been attending various parties. His Weibo was updated on time every day. At the seaside, in private rooms, or at various wine parties and evening parties, his figure would always be there. I clicked on the pictures, zoomed in, examined them carefully, and then closed them as if I were torturing myself. I tried to torture the heart that still loved Grant in this way again and again until I had accumulated enough disappointment and could leave Ly. After being together for 5 years, I knew Grant's friends around him quite well. Those I had never met before also became a part of our understanding of each other in the bits and pieces of our time together. Just by description, I could recognize them when I met them for the first time. So when I saw that girl who he had never mentioned before again and again in the photos, I suddenly realized that we were really drifting further and further apart. Just when I was sitting on the sofa, lost in thought, Ruth suddenly sent me a video call. "Valeria, There's an evening party the day after tomorrow. My old man insists that I attend, but I don't want to find a male partner. Will you accompany me to go? Ruth was my good friend. She came from a wealthy family, didn't have a princess temper, and laughed heartily. She was a girl who made people feel sunny at first sight. She and I first met also in the hospital. During the time when I just lost my voice, many things were inconvenient for me to do. Even if I wanted to call a nurse, because the hospital was too busy and I couldn't make a sound, I could only be anxious in vain. Ruth happened to pass by and happened to help me, and we became friends, very pure friends. She even learned sign language by herself for me. Watching her making gestures on the other side of the video, looking a bit clumsy, it made my heart feel warm. I didn't originally want to go out, but looking at the eager light in her eyes, I finally nodded and agreed, but I didn't expect to meet Grant at the wine party. He was dressed in a suit and tie, and a beautifully dressed girl beside him was holding his arm. When she saw me for the first time, she showed undisguised hostility towards me. That girl was the one who would surely appear beside him in the photos again and again. Grant's face didn't look good. Valeria, why are you here? He originally wanted to use sign language, but under the watchful eyes of everyone, he seemed to remember something, put down the hand he had just raised, and said this sentence with an unnatural smile on his face, looking very calm. President Grant, I remember your fiancée is a mute, right? Oh, just like you were back then, a deaf mute. If you don't use sign language for her, how can she know what you're saying? Another company boss who had always been at odds with Grant would naturally not miss any chance to ridicule him. It wasn't that there hadn't been such experiences before. But at that time, although Grant and I felt uncomfortable inside, we wouldn't care and just regarded it as wind blowing past our ears, making that aggressive face of his look extremely ridiculous. But now, an embarrassed expression appeared on Grant's face, and he even grabbed my arm and pulled me to a corner, quickly making gestures with his hands. He said, "You threw a tantrum for no reason some time ago. I gave you time to calm down. I thought you would still be as obedient as before. I didn't expect you to run here without a word. Don't you know that what you did made me very embarrassed?" Made him embarrassed? For a moment, I didn't know how to describe my emotions at this moment. I just showed up beside him, and I didn't even come with him. I was dressed appropriately and didn't do anything that would cause ridicule, but just because of my appearance, it would make him feel embarrassed. Probably the shocked expression on my face was too obvious. Grant let out a long sigh, realizing that what he said was a bit harsh, and there was a hint of regret in his eyes. He wanted to continue making gestures to say something to me. But before he could raise his hand, the delicate girl in the red dress ran over. She had a bright smile and waved to me. "Hello, Valeria. I'm Gemma, also Grant's friend. I've heard so much about you." After saying that, she suddenly covered her mouth and looked at Grant with a worried expression. "I don't know sign language. Valeria probably can't understand what I'm saying, right? It's my fault too. Knowing that she's a deaf mute, I didn't even think of learning the gestures from you in advance. After all, it's the first time we meet. We should at least leave a good impression on her, right?" Grant smiled at her. "It's okay. It doesn't matter whether she understands or not. You don't need to worry or apologize for this." After saying that, the two of them looked at each other and smiled. Then Gemma pointed to the middle of the dance floor. "It's time to dance. We agreed before coming that you would invite me to dance the first dance. You can't break your promise." She said it playfully, as if joking and also as if reminding. Grant's eyes fell on my face, looking a bit hesitant. Gemma's smile faded a bit, as if casually reminding, "When I came over just now, I also heard many people talking about Valeria." As soon as she said this, Grant's face looked ugly again for a moment. But without the previous hesitation, he immediately made up his mind. He decisively gestured to me. "I have to go to the dance floor to dance. I know you don't like noise, so you just stay here and have a good rest. Don't run around." After saying that, he and Gemma turned and walked towards the center of the dance floor. I just stood there, watching Grant's gradually disappearing back, and there was no longer the initial anger and sadness in my heart. The numbness after the pain gave me a rare calm at this moment. I opened my mouth, wanting to say something. To say that I liked noise very much and what I hated most was loneliness. To say that it was actually he who had always hated noise because those people would laugh at him. Grant hated being laughed at, so he even hated noise. Now, perhaps he was even hating me along with it. Gemma suddenly looked back at me, and from the emotion in her eyes, just at that moment, I knew what she was thinking. I felt a bit stuffy in the room, so I went to the backyard. There was a large swimming pool in the yard, and many people were standing scattered around it, chatting in groups of 3 or 5. Ruth came on behalf of her parents and was very busy at this moment and had no time to accompany me. I just sat by the pool. I don't know how long I sat there when a pair of high heels appeared in front of me. I looked up. Gemma was holding a glass of red wine in her hand. She looked down at me with her eyes lowered, and the look in her eyes seemed to be a challenge. I didn't like such a gaze, as if looking at a very lowly person. I stood up, and Gemma took a step back. When her eyes fell on the swimming pool behind her, a trace of amusement appeared in her eyes. She opened her mouth and said word by word, "Do you want to see who Grant will save?" For a moment, I didn't quite understand what she meant by that. But soon, I got it. Gemma suddenly reached out, grabbed my arm, and pulled me backward. I couldn't dodge in time and was dragged by her into the swimming pool together. Oh, I see. She wanted to prove her position in Grant's heart in this way. But I couldn't swim and could only struggle desperately, choking on several mouthfuls of water. Gemma didn't seem to be able to swim either and kept shouting for help. The sudden accident disrupted the slowly progressing party. Hearing the cries for help, Grant jumped down without hesitation. At that moment, Gemma stopped struggling and just raised her eyebrows at me with a smile, looking as proud as a little fox. She seemed extremely certain that Grant would save her first instead of me. But she didn't win. Grant swam to my side immediately and held me tightly. "Don't be afraid. I'm here. I'm here." His voice was very gentle, like coaxing a child. Just like in countless days and nights before, when I was unhappy or sad, he would coax me like this. Both Gemma and I were quickly rescued. Grant, who was no longer in a hurry, took off his coat and put it on me. There was still the usual concern in his eyes. However, there were always a few people standing by to watch the joke. "Is this Grant's fiancée?" It said that she was born deaf and mute. Now it seems she's also an orphan, with no power or influence, and she's disabled. The only thing she can boast about is that she and Grant have supported each other for 5 years. Now it can be considered that her hardships have finally paid off. This is called a good investment. With such poor conditions, I didn't expect her to bet right. But she's a disabled person, and an orphan. Grant still likes her so much? Whose fiancé would look like this when taken out? Aren't you afraid of losing face? Grant himself was a disabled person for a few years. He surely isn't afraid of losing face. There were many whispering voices. So many that Grant, who was originally very worried about me, had an extremely ugly look on his face after hearing these words. He slowly withdrew the hand that was about to touch me, and the look in his eyes when he looked at me was extremely complicated. He looked down at me without saying anything, but it seemed as if he had said everything. I smiled bitterly, suddenly feeling ridiculous for my hesitation just now. Clearly, the disgust and resistance in his eyes towards me couldn't be hidden. He might still love me, but not enough. So he always gave up easily. At least compared with his face, it was insignificant. My eyes were a bit uncomfortable. I reached out and wiped my tears randomly. When I looked up, I saw that familiar figure back at home. Grant was extremely angry again. He irritably untied his tie and slumped on the sofa. His brows were tightly furrowed. He wanted to say something to me, but then suddenly sighed and couldn't say anything. He didn't even want to look at me. I didn't say anything either. The weather was still a bit chilly, and I was cold after falling into the swimming pool. I had to take a hot bath first. But just as I was about to enter the bedroom, Grant's voice suddenly came. He said, "Valeria, if only you weren't born deaf and mute, and not an orphan." That's right. He still loved me, but also disliked me. He couldn't let go of the bits and pieces of the past 5 years, yet he also hoped that I could be as perfect as a fairy in the sky and wouldn't make him lose face. I suddenly felt that I was a complete joke. No wonder it said that the first thing a blind person does when regaining sight is to throw away the crutch that has accompanied them for a long time. To Grant, I was that useless crutch. I walked into the bedroom and suppressed my emotions to take a bath in the bathroom first. When I came out after changing clothes, I saw Grant sitting on the sofa making a phone call that he thought I couldn't hear, so he didn't avoid me when answering the phone. Gemma, are you drunk? As soon as Grant opened his mouth, I knew who was on the other end of the phone. Before leaving the wine party, Gemma had an extremely ugly look on her face, and the unwillingness in her eyes didn't escape my notice either. So when the phone call came, I knew what she wanted to do. As Grant listened to Gemma's voice on the other end of the phone, I could vaguely hear some sobbing, and Grant's face was getting uglier and uglier. Finally, he sprang up from the sofa. Don't cry. Find a place to sit. I'll come and pick you up right away. After saying that, Grant rushed out. But when he reached the door, it was as if he suddenly remembered something. He turned around to look at me and made gestures with his hands. There's something wrong with the company suddenly. I have to rush there right away. I may not come home tonight. Have a good rest. After saying that, he left without looking back. I just watched his back gradually disappear from sight. The words about breaking up that I had been struggling with in the bathroom still couldn't be said in the end. However, it didn't matter. I turned around and took out all the luggage that I had already packed in my room. Some time ago, when he didn't come back and didn't answer my calls, I didn't leave immediately. Being together is a very solemn thing. So when it comes to choosing to break up in the end, I also hope it can be done in a decent way. After leaving a note for Grant, I pulled my suitcase and went downstairs. In the past half a month, I had already found a new place to live. I wouldn't be so miserable as to be homeless. Just unexpectedly, as soon as I walked out of the community, I saw the relative that I thought I would never see again in my life. Valeria? The person in front of me had gray hair. The look in his eyes when he looked at me was a bit complicated. Even when he called my name, it sounded a bit unfamiliar. I stared at him too. This grandfather who was related to me by blood. The moment I saw my grandfather at the wine party, even though I had never met him before, it was like a telepathic connection. That face that resembled my mother's so much still made me recognize him at a glance. According to my mother, she eloped with my father and got married. Back then, she was young and impetuous. When she fell in love with someone, she was desperate to be with him. Although my father wasn't poor, he couldn't compare with my mother whose family had high-ranking officials. Their love didn't get my grandfather's blessing, and they were almost forcibly separated. My mother simply chose to elope, giving up everything her father could offer and throwing herself wholeheartedly into my father's arms. My grandfather was also very stubborn. So after my mother left, he chose to move his whole family abroad and settle there. Until now, this was the first time I had seen my grandfather. He was no longer just in the photos but standing in front of me, a living relative. Grandfather? I took 2 steps forward. My voice, which hadn't spoken for a long time, became a bit hoarse. There was a moment of surprise in my grandfather's eyes. Valeria, aren't you born deaf and mute? I shook my head, with some hot tears in my eyes. He seemed to want to ask something else, but when his eyes fell on the suitcase beside me, he didn't ask anything. He just silently took the suitcase for me. He smiled and said to me, "Don't be afraid. Grandfather will take you home." I know that actually my grandfather wanted to take my mother home more if she were still alive. And as the continuation of my mother, I returned to the villa where my mother had lived since childhood. When I was a child, when she told me bedtime stories, she always said how magnificent the villa she lived in as a child was, with a big garden full of roses she loved. But at that time, I didn't believe her at all. I thought she was like me, reading shoujo manga and fantasizing that she was a rich girl in distress. Unexpectedly, it was all true. Your grandmother is abroad. Her health hasn't been good in recent years, and she still doesn't know the news of your mother's death. If possible, come with me to visit your grandmother abroad sometime later." My grandfather's tone was very gentle, completely different from the fierce and cold description my mother gave. "Probably, time has smoothed all the edges." I nodded obediently. "Okay, I'll go, and I'll take good care of grandmother." As a wife, my mother was very qualified. As a mother, she was also very qualified. Only when it came to being a daughter, she always felt indebted until her death. However, it didn't matter. Since I inherited my mother's blood, I had the obligation to take care of her parents. Actually, my so-called cold and ruthless grandfather was really nice to me. I lived in the bedroom where my mother used to live. The room was as big as our whole apartment before. The floor was covered with all kinds of dolls. When I opened the cupboard, it was full of out-of-print limited edition bags and haute couture clothes. In short, it was very dreamy. My grandfather poured me a glass of milk. "Your mother used to be very delicate. She wanted the best of everything, but my daughter, of course, deserved the best. But that girl was too stubborn." When he said the last sentence, the sadness in my grandfather's eyes was hard to hide. He didn't say anything more but told me to go to bed early and then left the room. I sat on the bed. After a whole day of great joys and sorrows, I was already full of tiredness and couldn't wait to fall asleep immediately. But before going to bed, the notification sound of my special attention on Weibo rang again. I actually didn't plan to click on it to see, but the moment I put down my phone, my finger accidentally swiped open the pop-up window, and a magnified photo came into my eyes. In the photo, Grant, with a big smile on his face, was slightly bending down and kissing Gemma on the lips. Caption: "A very important person." I still had a sleepless night. I didn't sleep well all night. When I woke up, I had 2 huge dark circles under my eyes and was scolded by my grandfather. The children of our Xie family should always look glamorous and beautiful when they go out. After saying that, he took out a card from his pocket and stuffed it into my hand without asking. "Here, go to the mall. Find a friend to accompany you to buy clothes and some cosmetics and so on. Anyway, make yourself look good. Don't look like you've been drained of all your energy." I originally wanted to refuse. After all, it's not good to take someone else's card right after we just got to know each other. But my grandfather guessed what I was thinking and just glared at me. "It's just a small amount of money. What are you hesitating for? You're a child of our Xie family. Did Jorge raise you to be so stingy?" Jorge, my father, a man who wasn't overly successful in his career throughout his life but loved his wife to the core. To avoid getting scolded any further, I promptly took the card and then called Ruth, asking her to accompany me to go shopping. "Is the sun rising from the west? Valeria, haven't you and Grant been having a bit of a rough patch lately? How come you're in the mood to go shopping at the mall?" She knew the whole process of my relationship and had always been my steadfast supporter. So she knew best that, given my personality at the moment, I would probably just stay cooped up at home until I got over my emotional turmoil before leaving the room. I shook my head, took out a black card from my pocket, and told her that I'd be paying for everything today. Ruth thought I was joking, but didn't say much more and just dragged me into the store. As soon as we walked into a shoe store, we saw Grant squatting halfway in front of Gemma, bending over to put shoes on for her. Gemma comes from a pretty good family in our circle. She used to have a crush on Grant, but when Grant had that car accident later and became deaf and mute, she probably didn't like him as much anymore anyway. She didn't show up. It wasn't until Grant recovered that she started following him around again. Ruth calmly explained to me, but the expression on her face was anything but calm. That I knew that if I didn't stop her, she might have rushed right in and torn the faces of those 2 in front of us to shreds the next moment. "Aw, that scumbag and that slut. I'll scratch their faces," Ruth yelled quite loudly, so Grant, who was in the store, could naturally hear her. He looked up, and the smile on his face froze the instant he saw me. Then he stood up in a fluster, strode up to me, and quickly explained to me in sign language, "The heel of Gemma's high heels broke. I happened to be passing by, so I brought her to the mall to buy shoes." The clothes she's wearing today are not convenient for her to bend down, so I helped her. I shook my head and told him in sign language. You don't need to explain to me. We've already broken up. He was a bit taken aback. Valeria, when did we break up? We just had an argument yesterday. Which couple doesn't argue? But breaking up directly like this is really unnecessary. Apparently, he didn't go home yesterday, so he didn't see the note I left. I couldn't help but curl my lips into a sneer. Then I took out my phone and opened the kissing photo. Since things have come to this, let's part on good terms. Why make it so embarrassing? After all, we'd been together for 5 years. If it wasn't necessary, I didn't want to have a huge fallout in public. Last night, I was dragged by my friends to attend a party. It was just a game of truth or dare. I didn't actually kiss her. This photo is just an optical illusion. Valeria, you have to believe me. How could I possibly do something to betray you? Grant explained earnestly, constantly trying to hold my hand while speaking, but I avoided him every time. Gemma, who had already changed her shoes, also walked over. She still looked bright and charming. Even though she was so angry that the veins on her neck were showing, she still had a smug smile on her face. Why are you being so two-faced here? You knew he had a girlfriend, but you still had to butt in, and now you're pretending to be innocent. Are you from a family that sells tea? Is that why you're so two-faced? Ruth's words made Gemma's face turn bright red with embarrassment. She waved to me. Valeria, long time no see. If I'd known you'd be angry about this, I definitely wouldn't have played. I couldn't hold back my laughter and reached out to pull Ruth, shaking my head at her. There was no need. If a relationship is in crisis, the one who should be condemned the most is not the third party, but the unfaithful one who can't control themselves. That person is the one who truly deserves condemnation. Ruth was speaking quite loudly, so many people in the mall couldn't help but gather around to watch. Grant's face didn't look as good as it did before either. He grabbed my arm, wanting to take me away. I shook him off and told him in sign language, I left you a note at home. We're breaking up. I'm not joking. I've already moved my things out. Valeria, do you really want to break up with me? Grant's voice suddenly rose. While he was angry, I also saw a hint of relief in his eyes. I nodded and then pointed at Gemma beside him. You two look quite a match, but I won't wish you a happy marriage. After all, I really can't bring myself to say it. After signing this, I grabbed Ruth's hand, ready to leave. Grant directly blocked my way. Looking uncertain and still not giving up, he asked me several times repeatedly, Valeria, do you really want to break up with me? I haven't betrayed you, and I only like you. I said I'd marry you, and I won't go back on my word. So in this situation, do you really still want to choose to part from me? I nodded. I'll never regret it. The relationship of 5 years was severed completely. It wasn't as heart-wrenching as I'd imagined. Probably due to a bit of numbness, I even felt a bit nauseated inside, thinking that I was so blind to have fallen for someone with such a poor character. Ruth had been comforting me all along. When we first met, she knew that I was only temporarily unable to speak. And for all the decisions I made later, Ruth had scolded me many times for being so lovesick, but at that time, I was willing to endure it. Looking back now, I really was a bit crazy. For a man, I held back from speaking for a full 5 years just to keep him from feeling inferior. And what was the result? Once he recovered, he disliked that I couldn't speak and thought I wasn't good enough for him. People will always make a few bad choices in their lives. After all, you're not as smart as I am. You plunged headfirst into it, got all bruised and battered. Just cry it out and the pain will pass. When you wake up after a good sleep, it'll be a brand new day. Valeria, you're still young. There's no need to keep being sad for someone who isn't worth it. Ruth was really trying hard to console me. I nodded. I'm trying, and I'll never regret it again. And during the days after the breakup, I lived quite a peaceful life. Except for Ruth coming to see me every few days, I spent most of my time staying in the villa with my grandfather. This seemingly cold old man actually, many times when I woke up in the middle of the night to go pour water in the living room, I could hear soft sobbing coming from the bedroom across the hall. I peeked secretly. My mother's photo was placed on his bedside table, cherished like a precious treasure. Grandfather was missing his daughter. He would also talk to me about personal relationship issues. He'd even called abroad and mentioned finding a new boyfriend for me. That scared me so much that I quickly pulled him to talk about grandmother instead. My cold and expressionless grandfather, also with the family's inherited lovesickness, when talking about grandmother, his eyes were filled with tenderness that he couldn't hide. She'll probably like you a lot since you look so much like your mother. When you see her, she'll probably be sad.be sweet-tongued and coax her more. She hasn't suffered much in her life. Her only wish was to see that disappointing girl. After all, it was the old giving the young a send-off. Grandfather sighed, quietly turned his back to me, and wiped away a tear. He thought I didn't see it. Then he cursed his daughter twice in front of me, saying he didn't miss her and had already forgotten what she looked like. I didn't dare to say anything, just smiled at him, and got scolded again. Just as stupid as your mother. No matter how you heard it, it sounded like an insult. But I didn't dare to say anything. Otherwise, with grandfather's temper, he'd surely be cursing and swearing for a long time. As for his sudden return to the country. On the one hand, he wanted to secretly look for traces of my mother. On the other hand, an old friend of many years was going to hold an 80th birthday banquet, and he had to attend. Since you've already returned to your roots, you'll accompany me to this birthday banquet. Grandfather wasn't asking me. He patted the back of my hand, with a hint of complexity in his eyes. I suddenly realized something was wrong and asked, "What's the surname of your old friend?" Grandfather gave a forced smile. "That old geezer. He used to want to betroth you to his youngest grandson, but I refused. I thought he wasn't good enough for you. But I didn't expect that you, this silly girl, would pretend to be deaf and mute for 5 years just to be with him, and then, you were even looked down upon." Well, there was no need to say the surname. I already guessed it. Before setting out, grandfather had someone dress me up nicely. In his words, that was, "You're a child of our Xie family. When you go out, you represent the face of our Xie family. Especially since we're going to the Grant family today. We might run into that kid again. If you don't want to be too embarrassed, dress up nicely. Be as beautiful as you can." Men, what they can't have always stirs their interest. There'll always be a day when he regrets it. I didn't dare to refute. After all, when it came to the family's inherited lovesickness, I was the worst one. Following grandfather to the Grant family by car, I suddenly received a WeChat friend request from a stranger on the way. The profile picture was that eye-catching red dress. I could probably guess who it was. I didn't accept it. Instead, I clicked to reject it. The other person didn't give up and sent several more friend requests, typing directly in the request, "Is this all you've got? You don't even dare to add me on WeChat? But you do have some self-awareness." As a congenital deaf-mute orphan girl, walking beside Grant is constantly reminding him of that most embarrassing past of his. So it was quite sensible of you to choose to leave on your own initiative. "As long as you promise me that you'll never show up in front of Grant again, I'll give you a check to ensure you'll have no worries about food and clothing for the rest of your life." Grandfather glanced at it and muttered, "What the hell? That girl from the Gemma family has such a big mouth. She wants to ensure my girl has no worries about food and clothing for the rest of her life? Even if you emptied out the Gemma family, it wouldn't be enough." I silently put away my phone, and by then the car had already arrived outside the Grant family's residence. Actually, a long time ago, Grant had told me that his grandfather was going to celebrate his 80th birthday and hoped that I could be there as his grandson's wife. Back then, he hadn't recovered yet, and the look in his eyes when he looked at me was at least full of open and honest love. It's just the irony of fate. The banquet hadn't started yet. Although Grant, as the youngest generation of the Grant family, hadn't inherited the family business, he had managed to set up his own company on his own and was considered an outstanding figure among the younger generation. So early in the morning, he was already entertaining the guests at home. Gemma, as his female companion, also showed up early, looking every bit like the mistress of the house. So when they saw me and grandfather arriving together, the shock in their eyes was quite obvious. Especially Grant, there was a hint of wariness in his eyes. Most likely, he thought I was here to cause a scene. I just smiled without saying a word. Instead, Grandfather walked straight up to him and, in front of Grant's grandfather, raised his cane and tapped Grant on the head. "Are you the kid who bullied my family's girl?" "What's family's girl?" There was a hint of dissatisfaction in Grant's eyes. But after all, he was someone who could handle things on his own. After seeing the guest invitations in the morning and matching them with the people, he could also guess Grandfather's identity. Knowing that he needed to show respect, even though he was hit, he still stood respectfully beside Grandfather. Only the confusion in his eyes was quite obvious. Grandfather sneered and pointed at me standing beside him. "It's this girl, my granddaughter." After saying that, Grandfather winked at me. "Since we're here, you should still respectfully call him Grandpa Grant." I nodded and, under Grant's extremely shocked gaze, slowly walked up to Grandpa Grant. I took a deep breath and then, in the sight of everyone, slowly said, "Hello, Grandpa Grant. I wish you happiness as immense as the Eastern Sea and a long life of 100 years. This was the first time I had spoken in front of many people in 5 years. The birthday banquet went on quite smoothly, except for the fact that I, the orphan girl who had been ridiculed by everyone before for being congenitally deaf and mute, had suddenly become the granddaughter of the Xie family. I had relatives and could also speak. Grant was staring at me throughout the whole banquet. He seemed to have a lot to say to me, but under the watchful eyes of everyone and with my grandfather beside me, he didn't dare to do anything impulsive. Finally, when the banquet was over, he used the excuse of it being late at night and said that he wanted to send me and Grandfather home. I wanted to refuse, but Grandfather nodded and agreed. "Some things need to be made clear, Valeria. Don't forget about the trip the day after tomorrow." I hadn't forgotten. The plane tickets had already been booked. I was going abroad to see grandmother the day after tomorrow. As for the return date, it was hard to say. Thinking that this might be the last time we'd meet, I was unusually calm. When we arrived at the Xie family's villa, Grandfather made an excuse and went upstairs early, leaving the living room to me and Grant. "When did you recover?" There was a hint of restraint in Grant's eyes at the moment. I smiled. Is it possible that I've always been able to speak? However, back then, I thought there was someone who was really pitiful, like an abandoned puppy. In this brutally competitive family, he was abandoned because he couldn't speak, and he was even so desperate that he once wanted to jump off a building to commit suicide. I didn't want to see a lively life disappear in front of me. So I lied. To protect his self-esteem, I kept this lie going for a full 5 years. But in the end, what I got in return was that person's dislike and withdrawal. Thinking about it, what Grandfather and Ruth said was really right. My taste in men was really extremely bad. If you had told me earlier, told me that you weren't actually deaf and mute and that you were Grandpa Xie's granddaughter, maybe what? I directly interrupted Grant's words and, with a somewhat sarcastic tone, completed the unfinished sentence for him. "If I had told you earlier, then my existence wouldn't have made you feel inferior, nor would you have thought that I was a stain. When you saw me, saw that I could speak and could also be respected by others because of a good family background, we wouldn't be like rats in the gutter anymore. After becoming a dragon and a phoenix, when we looked back at each other, we wouldn't remember those not-so-good times in the past. I've watched Empresses in the Palace and always thought that the relationship between the Emperor and Empress Isho was really sad. One was the Emperor, and the other was the Empress. They should have been the two most noble people in the world, but they had such an ending that they would never see each other again in this life. There was also a popular comment from netizens: 2 rats got together. One became a dragon, and one became a phoenix. Whenever they saw each other, the 2 rats would remember that they were originally rats. But, Grant, we're not rats. We are upright. We're just different from others because of our physical defects. Besides that, we all live in the sunlight. It's you who think you're a rat, that whenever you think of me, you'll remember the bad experiences in the past. So you want to get rid of me, but you don't want to bear the blame." While sighing with regret, you also force yourself to accept me. You think you're the most affectionate man in the world. Because you want to be responsible for me, you're willing to sacrifice your own lifetime of happiness, and I should be extremely grateful to you, with my heart and eyes full of you, loving you for a lifetime. But why should I? I'm not the kind of person who has to marry you, nor am I reaching for the moon. We are equal. From the moment I heard what he said to his friends in the private room, I knew that Grant had never put me on an equal footing with him. This was the real reason that made me completely give up on him. After listening to my words, Grant was silent for a long time. Finally, he just looked up at me, with a faint smile on his face and a choked voice. He asked, if I say that I want to start all over again, as if none of these things had happened. We get to know each other again. I'm Grant, just Grant, and you're still that kind and brave Valeria. Will we get back together? Look, when he said this, it made me look down on him even more. I couldn't help but close my eyes, thinking that Grant at this moment looked a bit hideous. If he had said, I was wrong in the past, but what's past is past. Let's part on good terms and still be friends in the future, then maybe I could have thought a bit more highly of him. Instead of, after learning about my identity and knowing that I wasn't deaf and mute, immediately dumping Gemma, with whom he had an ambiguous relationship by default, and then turning around to get back together with me. Grant, you really disappoint me. Precisely because of this disappointment. So when I left, I didn't feel too sad. Except for being reluctant to part with Ruth, I didn't have any other relatives in China. So when I thought about being able to see the grandmother who loved my mother the most, as my mother had described, when I went abroad, I was excited. As for Grant, he sent me many more messages later, all asking me to get back together, saying that he wanted to start all over again. But a broken mirror, no matter how you try to fix it, can never be restored to its original state. So I refused him and resolutely embarked on the journey abroad. This time, I'll try not to be so lovesick and hope that I can be more discerning and not misjudge people again. Time flew by, and several years passed. Grandmother's health wasn't good. Especially after learning about the news of my mother's death in a car accident, she was even more devastated. She struggled for 3 years but still didn't make it through that winter. Grandfather, who had always been serious and seldom smiled, cried like a lost child on that day. Later, he just sat there quietly all day long, holding grandmother's photo. Winter passed, and spring had just arrived when grandfather also left. He was lying on the lounge chair in the yard, holding the photos of my mother and grandmother in his arms, with a smile on his face, passing away peacefully. In the 4th year after coming abroad, I lost my family members completely again. After handling the funerals of grandfather and grandmother, holding the photos of my mother and grandmother in his arms, with a smile on his face, passing away peacefully, I completely took over their businesses. I was so busy learning and managing the company that I hardly had time to sleep. Occasionally, I would hear news from China. Grant, due to the infighting within the family and being unable to compete with his cousins, had another car accident. It was somewhat expected. After all, the previous 2 car accidents were also the result of him losing in the family infighting. Only this time, he injured his leg and might never be able to stand up again. There was no hope left for him. When Ruth got married, she sent me an invitation. So in the 7th year after going abroad, I returned to China for the first time. Ruth looked really beautiful in her wedding dress. She wanted to hand me the bouquet, but I didn't take it. After all, I didn't have a good eye for men, and there were too many businesses left by grandfather and grandmother. It was better for me to focus on my career. I also went to visit my parents' graves. Since my company was abroad, I couldn't stay too long. When I was about to leave the country again, Grant found me. He was sitting in a wheelchair, looking extremely pale. He was so thin that he looked like skin and bones. As soon as he saw me, he said to me, "Someone told me that life is precious. So this time, no matter how desperate I am, I won't do anything stupid. Do you think if I listen to her like this, will she be willing to give me another chance?" I sneered and bent down to look at him. "But do you think you're worthy of her now?" With that one sentence, his face turned as white as a sheet. I'm not a nice person. On the contrary, I can hold grudges. I gave him the chance to part on good terms, but he insisted on coming up to me to talk about the sad things in the past. So I could only return the knife that he had stabbed me with. Does it hurt? Yes, it does. That's right.